Hi, this is Rob at SY8 Productions, and this is the first video on drum mixing. If you haven't already, do check out the previous video on drum editing using Beat Detective to make sure all your transients are pretty much set to the grid, and you take all your clips and consolidate them so they're continuous clips, and it'll just run through a lot smoother. And once you've done that, then you're ready to mix. So let's move on to the mix. Okay, in the mix we've got a kick drum, snare drum, mono overhead, left and right mics placed far left and right of the kit to capture a good stereo image, a right and left tom, floor tom and room mic. Now if you want to know which microphones I used and where I placed them and why, etc., check out the video on the drum recording setup. Now moving on, what we do is to get all these drums in a particular color, because it makes it a lot easier on the eye when you've got multiple tracks like guitars and drums, a couple of percussion tracks in here which I've put in orange, and you know, it does help if you can see them at a very quick glance without having to sort of just quickly look at what they're called. So very quickly I'll just go make sure view and mix view has got your track color selected, and then if you go to window, color palette, and then in color palette I'm just going to change all those selected from blue to another color, so mustard. There you go. Why? It doesn't really matter, whichever color you want. I just happen to like this color. So once you've done that, then you can move on to the next bit. Okay, so now I need to set up a drum bus. So every group of instruments has its own drum bus, or more to the point, it has an auxiliary channel, and everything is sent to that auxiliary channel, so you can control everything together. For example, all these drums are set to their own drum bus, and it means I can control the volume of the drums on one fader once I've set all the levels. So as you can see here, I've set all these levels to what I feel they should be at the moment, until I start adding all the bass and the guitars and whatever else, and then I can control them through that one fader. I can also add any inserts, compressors, limiters, etc., and on that master drum bus. Then the drum bus goes to the submix. A submix is an auxiliary which everything goes eventually to the submix, and that controls the whole track: drums, bass, guitars, vocals, the lot. And the reason it goes through a submix before it goes to the output is because I can then control by using any compressors, limiters on that submix, and because this actually works as a pre-fade, meaning the inserts work before the fader, as opposed to post-fade, which on a master fader the inserts work after the fader, meaning that if I adjust the fader and do a fade out on a master, then it will affect the compressors, etc., that are being used on here. Whereas this, on an auxiliary channel, it doesn't. It actually makes no difference to the settings of the compressors of what the tracks are feeding into them, the levels, etc. It won't make a difference once you start pulling the fader up or down, if you need to do any adjustments for the track overall. Right, to set up the drum bus, you select all your drums, and then press Alt and Shift on your keypad simultaneously. Keep those held down, and then any one of these select and change it from whether it be on output 1 and 2 or submix in my case, and take it to new track. And that will select an auxiliary input, and we call that drums. And what that does now, it assigns all your drums to a drum bus. Okay, so all these now are going to the drums, and that is my drum bus here, and drum bus there. The output goes to the submix, as I stated previously. Everything goes to the submix, so if I drag all my buses on this side of the screen, at least I then know all my buses in green generally are going to the submix, like the bass and the guitars and the percussion, etc., all going to the submix. And that is my bus created, which is great because now I can set all my different levels, and once all those levels and pans are set, I can then control all of it simultaneously through this one fader. So if I press play, And there we go. So now I can control all the levels of my drums on one fader, and I can also put in a compressor and a bit of EQ, and then I can generally apply to the whole drum track any slight little levels that need controlling, slight bits of EQ that I might need to perhaps boost at the top end or the low end if I've really compressed loads on the individual drums, particularly the kick, and that helps to control that. And that's pretty much it with the bus, and then I move on to the individual drums. So the first thing is to deselect the drum group, because if I hit solo, it either selects solo for all the drums or they're not on. So if they're all off, that's fine. But then if I deselect the drum group by hitting the A key, because that's the drum group is actually group A, and then that takes it off the drum group, and I can then just hit solo on any one of these and it will just select that track. So select the kick on its own, and not a bad kick drum sound to start with, and the reason why it's pretty clear is, of course, because of the way it's recorded, and also because I've actually taken out a lot of the spill without needing to use a gate. There's a little bit of spill between each transient hit, a little bit of snare and hi-hat in the background. Sometimes it was a little bit harsh, and without over-gating, I'd rather do what we call a strip silence on this. So if you go into edit and strip silence, what that does is it enables you to select the transients, and all the stuff in between it can cut away. So if there's any little bits of background, hi-hats, snare hits and things like that, it could cut those away. Just press separate and then strip it, and then I consolidated it back together again, and that's what was left, this clear kick drum sound. Okay, my first insert is a compressor. Now if we just open up that, and the idea is that I've set this in a way that all the transients of the kick are being a little bit more consistent. Now if we look at the kick itself, we can see that most of these kicks are pretty level, but there are a few that are slightly quieter or higher, lower, etc. There's a little bit of inconsistency going on. Now, we don't need to make this so consistent that it's like a constant velocity. That would be just so robotic, and we want to keep the human feel. Now, although these have been played pretty well, just to give it a little bit more consistency through the mix, a bit of compression is very, very useful. So what I'm going to do is just show you quickly that what happens is that by taking the threshold down to about minus 27 dB in this case, and set the ratio to a 4:1 ratio, it means anything over the threshold is being turned down by a 4:1 ratio. So for every 4 dB that's going in, it's only allowing 1 to come out. And the attenuation, hopefully I'm aiming for, is to go between 2 and 6. Not much more than 6 on a kick to start with, but at least it's going to be a bit more consistent now. So playing it without, and then I'll take bypass off so you can hear how it sounds with the compression on. Okay, so that's got a little bit more consistency, a bit more impact, and with the ratio set as it is, the attack is pretty slow, so it allows, I'll show you, this first bit of the transient to come through, so it's not being toned down too quickly. The compressor is not working that quickly, or too quickly I should say, so it just starts to let that first bit come through, then it starts to turn down and then release it very quickly, so it turns back down to its original volume, so I'm not cutting off too much of the sustain of the kick. Sometimes if you've got a bit of ring on snares and things like that, it can sometimes help to have a longer release if you want that real dampened disco sort of sound, but generally I'd leave it a fairly slow release, and that's pretty much. And then of course the makeup gain, because I'm getting some attenuation up to about sort of between, let's say, 3-6 dB. If we look at that, There you go. So there's certain ones, the biggest kick hits, the louder ones, they're being attenuated by about 5 to 6 dB, and that's just over 5 dB makeup gain. Push that up and it levels the sound out a bit, and it obviously brings the quieter beats up to match the louder ones. So I say match, it just creates less distance between the louder and the quieter hits, so the dynamic range is reduced, and that gives you that consistency. So that's the first thing I do with the inserts there. Okay, after the compressor I've got an EQ, so Pro Tools stock plugin EQ bypassed in action. Now there's a substantial difference this time. The kick really is starting to push through a lot more when it's got the EQ on. When I say push through, sort of a little bit more low end pushing through. So what I've done here is I set my high pass filter to 45 hertz, so anything that's 45 hertz below I'm turning down, and then I'm boosting round about 60 hertz. 60 hertz is usually a good one for most kicks, round about that I find, and I just push that up by literally a few dB, in this case 4.4 dB. I then sort of play around with frequencies that are either problematic, so around about here, anything between the sort of 150 and 350 mark, it sometimes can create a bit of sort of muddiness. Sometimes you can try it, if you're not, well, if you're using headphones, do this at a low level, because it will destroy your ears, but that is to sort of boost things, just to sort of boost with a very thin cue and hear how these sound and sweep around until you get that problem frequency that just sounds nasty. So for example, if we hear this, sounds quite boxy, so we can pull that back down by a few dB, just widen it a little bit, and that will hopefully control that a bit. Same with this one here, and then I've just shaved off a little bit there. Okay, so what I've done there is around about 800, so yeah, anything between sort of 600-700, even up to 900 sometimes you can cut around there, and that helps a little bit. Not too wide a cue, but not too thin, just to give it a little bit of a scoop and sort of demuddy that kind of basketball effect of a kick. A lot more fullness, more rounded, nice sounding kick. And then underneath I've got another plugin, which in this case, this is a channel strip. Now you can use the Pro Tools stock channel strip to do the same thing. I like the SSL, which is from Waves, third-party plugin, and what I like to do with this is actually add a bit more EQ again. So same thing, I'm using a high pass filter around about 44 45 originally on that one, and the main thing really to look at is the fact I've got quite a boost at 8K, in fact about 6, nearly 7 dB of boost, and I've got another boost round about at the sort of just over 2K, so to sort of give it a bit more bite, it gives it a lot more attack, boosting it round about there, and a lot more sort of snap and attack round about these 8K frequencies. So without and with. Now with a good pair of headphones and decent monitors, you should hear that it's subtly lifted out a little bit more the top end, giving it a bit more attack, and that's how you get that really kind of snappy, great kick drum sound. The last stage of the kick is really a little bit of reverb, so not too much. I'm just sending it to the same reverb I've sent the snare drum to, which I'll come on to shortly, but really just a little bit. You'll hear the difference with a lot and then none at all, and then I'll bring it up just to give it that slight little bit of natural ambience, so it sounds like it's actually in a room rather than a totally dead kick drum. That's pretty much it. So that's all I do with the kick there as far as reverb goes. And then I also send it to what I call a sub kick. Now this is a tip I picked up from a webinar that Steve Albini did, and it was really useful. He does it with analog kit, but the same thing applies with a DAW, and that is he runs it through, he sends the kick to an EQ. So what you do is you put an EQ on an auxiliary channel, send it to this kick to that auxiliary channel by however much you want, and just so you can hear how it sounds in pre, so that's before this fader, so it doesn't matter what I do here, so I can unsolo that and it should still come through. And it does. Right, so now what you do is you put a single band EQ and you just find the frequency where it really gives it the most power. So it's the real kind of low end frequency here. So I've set this to about 52.4. Without. And with. So that gives you the power of that frequency, it gives you an idea of where it is. So just turn it down a little bit. Okay, the next thing he does, now that gives it a lot more bottom end power, but then what he also does, he sends this auxiliary to itself. So it sends the sub kick to the sub kick. Why, you may ask? Well, it gives it a kind of, what happens is it gives it some self oscillation if you push it too much, and you'll hear what I mean by pushing this fader up. So there's a lot going on there. So what you need to do is just get it to the point where it's almost self-oscillating and bring it down a bit. And that'll be about right. So now if I just blend the two together, so take that off pre, just so to blend them together, and then this should sound pretty meaty. Okay, so without and with. Okay, so that gives you a lot more of that low end power, and that's pretty much it on the kick drum. On the snare, the first plugin I use is a gate, and the whole point of a gate really is to get rid of anything that falls below the threshold, or in other words, to try and get rid of anything that is spilling on the snare mic that's not a snare drum. So if you hear it bypassed, and with gate on, okay, so it's pretty much just the snare on its own. Certain bits will come through, but most of it is just pretty much the snare. Set it to 100:1 ratio, that's a hard gate, so anything that falls below the threshold gets pretty much cut out. And also the range helps it to, whether it actually is turned down by a certain amount of dB, so that's maximum reduction or gain reduction, but I set it to about here on a snare just so it's kind of still ringing through a little bit. The attack is very quick, so it allows the snare to come through and open the gate very quickly. It shuts reasonably quickly but not too soon, so it still allows some resonance to come through, otherwise it just drops as soon as the snare gets struck. The moment the volume starts to drop, that means all the sort of the ring, the resonance, it will drop out. So I'm letting a little bit of ring through and a little bit more by the hold. If I turn the hold anti-clockwise, you'll hear it really does cut the snare out quite a lot, whereas if it's put towards the right hand side clockwise, it allows the gate to hold longer, so the gate stays open longer, and it will allow some of those resonances to come through a bit more. So if you listen to this, Okay, so you've got a lot more resonance coming through that. So that's pretty much it with the snare. So that's the gate, and we'll move on to the compressor underneath. Okay, the next one in line is the compressor. It's set up in a similar way to the kick, and that is a fairly slow attack, quick release, and whatever goes above the threshold is being turned down. In this case, almost a 5.5 to 1 or ratio. The attenuation is going to be around about 6 dB when I press play. Okay, so the louder hits are being turned down by about 6 dB. The quieter ones are either being untouched or very slightly compressed, so it gives it a bit more consistency. And because it's up to about 6 dB attenuation, makeup gain set at that, at the almost 6 dB, and that gives it a good, consistent, snappy snare sound. Right, moving on to EQ, I have a high pass filter set at just over 90. Anything below that, unnecessary. I've actually put a boost around about just over 200 Hertz. That gives it a bit more warmth, a bit more depth, a bit more low end, a bit more body. Cut away a little bit around the sort of 670 here, where it was sounding a bit muddy and boxy, and then boosted the high sort of mid frequencies around about 2.5K, and again at 8K just a little bit, just to give it a little bit more bite, a bit more attack, without, with. Okay, sounds a little bit more full, a lot more bottom end, and that will blend. It might sound a bit odd on its own, but in the mix sounds great, and as we should always really mix with everything going through. So when it comes to EQ, you can make the right decisions. This is just to give you an idea of how these things do work, what the different frequencies are when they've been cut and boosted. So that's the first stage of the first snare strip. So far it sounds like this. Okay, pretty snappy. Now, the next step, I'm still not satisfied with the snare. I want to give it a little bit more body, bit more power. So to do that, what I tend to do is I take a copy of the snare, so literally Alt Shift D and duplicate it. Okay, that, and you'll get exactly another snare track, a duplicate rather. And what I do with that, same settings, but this time I actually go to the harmonic, plug in harmonic, and go to lo-fi, which is this one. And in lo-fi, what I do is I just add a little bit of saturation, and just a little bit of saturation, 1.2 there, tiny little bit of distortion, and then with all these sets pretty much the same as the original snare, but this time with the lo-fi, so you hear how it sounds. In just put it through the drum bus so you can hear it. Okay, let's just take everything off so you can hear it in solo. So when you hear it in bypass, it's the same as the original snare. When it's in lo-fi mode, or got the lo-fi plugin operating, it then gives it a little bit of saturation, some slight distortion. It actually makes it sound like I've perhaps put a little bit more snare on it. It's a bit like putting a microphone underneath the snare drum, which I didn't do. I just had one mic on the top, so it's kind of gives the almost the illusion that there's actually a mic on top and above. So it's a bit like having your snare top, snare bottom mic. So that's the first thing I do there, duplicate that and then blend them together, and the blend hopefully sounds a little bit more full. So listen to the original snare on its own, and then I will press that solo and it will blend them together. Okay, a bit more of a brighter sound there, which is good. And then finally what I do is, to be fair, I actually take a sample to blend in, which is something I use from Steve Slate, and Slate Digital has some great drum samples, and I use that to sort of run the snare through and then pick a snare. But to be fair, what I did with this, I actually took a one shot. So I just took literally a snare drum sound that I recorded at the end of the drum session and got the drummer to hit every drum on its own in isolation. And I used the snare hit from that, and I actually put that into the Slate program and then blended that so it was just an original sound of the drum on its own without anything else, and then blended that with another snare that was quite similar that just had a little bit more ring, and just that blend of them all together came from a sample. Again, you don't have to do this, you can use one shots and you can go for the whole tab to transient and just copy and paste every time there is a snare transient on another track underneath and create it that way. Again, that's quite time consuming, but again worth it if you want a slightly fuller snare sound. But for this, what I tend to do is just use the blend. So if you hear this on its own, I'm just going to listen to the through the drum bus, and we've got this. So that's just the snare on its own with a little bit of a mix of a slightly more resonating snare blended into it, and together they sound like this. So okay, and that's just a good blend of those. Okay, it's not a humongous difference, but it just makes a difference for the bite. It cuts through a little bit more. But again, like I said, you don't have to do this. It sounds fine without. If I just play them all together and you listen to how it sounds so far without the blended sample. Okay, so again, that's just something I like to do, but if you don't have to. You can just add a little bit more reverb to the snare and it will have a very similar effect. There's just a slight bit more resonance, bit more room sound on that snare, and that's pretty much it. Oh, except for one thing, that I do tend to then take these snare sounds and I send them to their own bus. So again, what I did there, instead of sending these directly to the drums, I did the whole Alt-Shift-Click and went to new track and created a snare bus, which is there somewhere. There we go, snare. And now they're sent to the snare. My snare bus is there, and then I've put a little bit of EQ on the snare overall, so without it. And I'll just take these off and you can hear how it sounds when it goes through the snare, which the snare should go to the drum bus, which is there. There we go. Okay, so now what I do is with the snare is put a slight EQ on the overall snare. So again, I can control all the three snares together with this volume here on the snare bus, and I can add a little bit of EQ. So again, what I've done there is just boosted a little bit around the 200 again, just to give it a bit more warmth. So that's it. So then the next thing is to send these to reverbs. So what I do with the snare is send it to two different reverbs, and this is how I do it. Right, I've got two sends set up on my snare channel, and the first one is sent to what I call a snare verb, which is an auxiliary channel I've set up there, and I've set up another auxiliary channel there, and that one's called plate verb. And then I send the signal of the blended snares to be reverberated. I use 2 reverbs blended. I just like that sound. It's a preference. It's not you know, a must, but I do like it. So without the plate one, let's just hear how the snare sounds with this one. So if I just listen to the snare on its own, so let's just turn all these off solo, and let's just hear the snares. So that was without, and with. Okay, quite snappy. So how much I'm feeding into that is going to this one here. So reverb 1 is the setting. If you go to inserts and go to reverb, that's where you choose your reverbs. You've got deverb, which is fantastic. That's a stock plugin. Some of the reverbs I use, I must admit, are ones that are third party or Avid extras, but you know, you set a reverb that you like the sound of, and this one is set to a medium wood room sound, which is quite a nice sort of sounding room, and I cut out a little bit of the low end and the top end, so it doesn't sound too tinny or sort of flutter echoey, and it doesn't go on forevermore with the low end, to give it a more of a crisp sound. And the time of the reverb is set at 593 milliseconds, which it's not a second, that would be 1,000, and you don't want it set too long, because then every time you hit the snare, the time it takes for the snare, each snare hit, if that is if the reverb's set longer than that time, so if you had a track that had you know, a snare every second, and if your reverb was beyond a second, then it sounds very cluttered because the reverb's taking longer to die than the actual snare hits. So that's kind of the principle behind that. So it's fairly short, and I've also got a plate reverb, and that one's set up to that one's actually a bit longer, that's almost a second, and I've just sent a slightly less to that, and that gives it a little blend of a slightly longer reverb with a shorter, more ambient sound, and the blend together sounds very, very nice. Well, I think so anyway. So here is the snare with the additional plate reverb. Actually, let's just listen to it on its own with the plate reverb. So let's mute this one. So plate reverb. Okay, so that's more of that kind of real long reverb sound that you kind of associate reverb with, and then blending that with the snare verb. Okay, just gives a little bit more body, and that's pretty much how I use the reverbs, which isn't a humongous amount on the kit generally. It's only the snare and a very, very small amount of kick I send. That is about it. The rest of the reverb really is I say there is no rest off. That's it. That's pretty much all I do on the drums. There's other things to give me more ambience, and I'll come on to that shortly with overheads. So this is what we do with the overheads. I must mention before I go on to overheads that the reverbs are actually sent to the drum bus as well. So that means every time I mute the drums or take it off solo, that means it will cut out everything, all the drums and all the reverbs. So that's controlling everything to do with drums. Okay, right, now the overhead is soloed, so you can have a listen to this. Okay, so I just turn that down a bit because there's quite a lot of power coming through these drums in isolation, and there's all sorts going on with room mics and things like that, which I'll come on to. So the overhead, just to get the blend of the overall kit in its natural sort of ambient form with the close mics, and I just like the balance about there to keep it pretty tight and snappy. The channel strip I've used here is the Pro Tools stock plugin, and it's just literally, I've set up my own kind of channel setting for the overhead, and what I've done here is I've actually filtered out quite a lot. I filtered out over 200 hertz of the low end to get rid of a lot of the kick, to be honest. And that's at about 200. It does reduce the amount of kick that comes through, because there's so much kick coming through already with the kick and the sub kick, to then have the kick blended with this background sort of woolliness. It just did sound, as I said, a bit woolly. So what I did was cut away that and reduce some of these frequencies around here, which is around about the 740, 50. That's where there were problem frequencies that just weren't sounding great, so I just cut those out a little bit and then gave it a little bit of top end here, and use the high pass filter to take away anything round about the sort of, oh well, here we go, 11, so 11k, and I've very little ratio on the compression, so when you hear the overall compressed sound here like so. It's just very little. The threshold's set, so again with a sort of fairly sort of medium attack, and slow release, medium to slow release, and it's really just kind of so gentle that there's just very little compression going on that, if any. You know, it's sort of literally just about touching here. So it's set very low ratio. It's turning it down so slightly, which is why I've put a slightly quicker attack on, just so it actually does cut something through to actually trigger off the compressor. But it's just very gentle, if any, and that's pretty much it on the overhead. So that's the first thing I did. The next thing is the left and right mics, where I've got the stereo spread, and I did pretty much the same there. Again, similar frequency drops. This time I've actually cut away even more of the low frequencies, right up to about 750. I've really scooped out the low end, so I'm really getting the zing of the cymbals. Okay, and that's what I've done on that left and right, so that gives you this kind of sound. That picks up nicely the ride. That's the hi-hat, that's the ride. The thing is, scooping out the low end's good, because it really does give it that sort of high frequency sort of crispness of the cymbals, and also cutting away anything that's sort of spilling, that's boomy, and this does also take in a bit of the, it records some of the floor toms as well, so it doesn't pick up too much of that, just gives it a little bit of bite there, which I've also got a mic on the floor tom anyway, so that gives you that definition. I'll come on to the toms in a sec. But that's pretty much it for like on my middle overhead and left and right, sort of not overhead, side heads I guess, and the blend together. And then you add the kick and the snare, and you've got something close to a pretty good drum sound already. And there you go. Okay, next toms. So the right tom and the left tom. I've got a Pro expanded gate on this, and what I've done here is, without explaining the gate again, it's just these are the settings I've used, and the idea is that it is isolating anything that is not a tom. So the tom cuts through, anything else gets cut away. To be fair, it does cut away slight resonance of the ring of the tom, but I don't really want too much ring of the tom on the separate tracks. I've got the rooms, I've got the left and the right coming through a little bit more, and I just want it to be a really good sort of I guess just to give it more definition. All right, so this is the sound of the tom on its own. Okay, without the gate. Okay, so you've got a bit of cymbal coming in the background, so that takes the cymbal away. And the EQ is fairly subtle, really. Again, I've cut away anything below the sort of 90, 97 in this case, and boosted a little bit around the 184 just to give it a little bit more warmth. And then I've boosted 4.3k and just about 8k there as well, so that's a good boost there to give it that kind of crispness, and it cuts through the mix a bit more. Okay, and the same pretty much with the left. I've just cut away that there was something that was sounding a bit over, just a bit nasty, ringing out, so cut that and boosted similar, around about 160 there. Again, expander, pro expander on that, and on the floor tom. And the difference with the floor tom really is the EQ, and those are the EQ settings. I've really boosted the top to give it a little bit more tap to cut through, so it really gives you that tappy feel. And also, once you've boosted the hell out of the top end, you need to boost a bit of the bottom as well to compensate. So I've boosted around about 88 here and cut away anything below 75. So without that, if we just listen to the floor tom, and let's just find a bit where there is a floor tom, and here we go. So coming up, there we go. Now without it, and now with the EQ. Okay, so there's a lot more top end coming in on that, and on its own it might sound a bit harsh, but together, when you hear these toms, okay, and for it to cut through in the mix more with the rest of the kit, this is how it sounds. Let's just put the snare back on. So all together. So it really does cut through. And then finally, it's the room mic. So what I do with the room mic is I've just literally EQ'd, and I've just literally cut away the low and the top and scooped out a little bit here to get rid of a lot of the boominess of the kit, because it's a small room. So I just wanted to add a little bit of the room reflection, but the problem was, being a small room, the dimensions by 5 meters by 3, it really does kind of trigger off a lot of the low end of the kick, and I don't want too much low end on the room. I just wanted it to give it a bit of natural reverb and not too much sort of wooliness, so I've cut out a lot there and the top end, and just scooped out a bit here. And without it, it sounds like well, let's just hear on its own without the snare. So okay, so with that, it sounds okay, a bit thin, but if I take it off bypass, and obviously it thins this out even more, but it gives it that actual natural ambience without it clashing too much with the kick and the snare that are the close mic ones. So again, hear how it sounds. And together with the kit, with the snare on as well. Okay, so it gives you that kind of natural ambience, and to make it sound even more sort of that sort of natural ambience even more, I duplicated it. So here goes a duplicate of the overhead. Here we go, that's the duplicate, and send that to the drum bus. Here we go. So duplicated that, and this one, what I did was pretty much the same again, same EQ, so it was a duplicate, but what I did was underneath it I've added a compressor, and I've really compressed it at 24:1 ratio, really slammed it, and this is how it sounds in solo. And let's just take the snare off again. Okay, so this is how it sounds on its own without the compression. Really trashy. Okay, but the blend, so this is over compressed, but the blend makes it sound more natural. The point of this really is, by really compressing the hell out of this, is it's really pushing it and lifting the quieter sounds up, so it's really lifting out the ambience of the room and blending it with the original. So with just the original on its own, and there you go, you've got quite a good natural ambient sound already. So blending that with the overhead here and then everything else, it really does start to sound like a good natural drum kit. And there you go, and that's the drums pretty much mixed. So I hope you found that useful. For any further information, please check out the website sy8productions.com, and see you soon.